I've just watched the 2018 film Frontrunner with Hugh Jackman in the starring role, and it's about the circumstances around the presidential campaign of Senator Gary Hart of Colorado, who was running for the Democratic nomination. And it was a big scandal at the time, and he had to drop out of the race due to speculation and allegations that he'd had an affair. He was a married man at the time. It was a strong film, very good performance by Hugh Jackman. He got critical acclaim for it, in fact. Um, but the film is a very interesting look at the role that mass media plays in the modern era, in terms of how it approaches question marks over politicians' private lives. And it's kind of been used as a case example. Gary Hart himself was interviewed about it. He's in his 80s now. He's still married. His wife stood by him despite the tensions. Um, and he reiterated some of the positions he made then. Now, I think that Hugh Jackman's character, Hugh Jackman's portrayal, casts Hart in quite a sympathetic light, although you also get the impression he sort of dug himself a little bit deeper with his very stoic attitude and not in insisting it was entirely a private matter. Basically, he was photographed with a young woman, Donna Rice, who's now an advocate for internet safety, outside his Washington, D.C. home. And reporters from the Miami Herald took pictures of this. And it kind of became a cause celebre, like I say, of the power of the press and how it relates to coverage of politicians' private lives. This was a 1988 presidential campaign. Coincidentally or not, the late 80s was also a time when Britain's tabloids were almost at their zenith of sales. They've declined now, although a lot of that's with the online format. Um, Hart made a speech, or rather, Hugh Jackman's portrayal of Hart made a speech at the end of the film in which the discourse of American politics has changed, in which the press become hunters and presidential candidates hunted. And how can that inspire young people to get involved in politics if they think that would be, if you have the brightest minds in the country, the best minds, the best people, if they think that's the sort of treatment they'll get, then they would be reluctant to run. He said himself that's why we have Donald Trump. Um, Both Trump and Bill Clinton, of course, have been accused of all sorts of improprieties with their relationships. Trump, I understand, did have affairs in his private life. My own instinct on this, I've dabbled in both journalism and politics at low level, but I've had a little bit of experience of both worlds. Very low level. I've run as a council candidate and I'm doing a journalism course. I took journalism at university. My gut feeling has always been that in both the United States and the UK, we do put a bit too much weight on politicians' private lives, and I think maybe we need to look at France. The French have long had a sort of understanding that it is just that. Now, maybe that's cynical. Maybe they expect male politicians to have affairs. I don't know. But the fundamental question is it in the public interest? Now, I'm not going to outright say there is absolutely no case to be made there. And the good thing about this film is it shows the pressures that the journalists involved were under as well. So it doesn't totally vilify them as, sleazy tabloid hacks. It shows the difficult decisions they had to make, whether to run with the story or not. Um, Journalism's a difficult job, and so is politics. Journalists and politicians face pressure in different ways. Journalists aren't in the public eye to the same extent, but they also have pressures. And it's worth noting that Hart's kind of aloof attitude didn't entirely help his case. He wouldn't even tell his own staffers, closest advisors, what was going on because he felt the principle that it was private business was a very, very strong one. And Hart, of course, was the front runner. He was a popular candidate, charismatic, although, like I say, a bit aloof. Um, but there's been other cases in the United States, for example, John Edwards, 2008. He was charismatic figure. Um, and then what happened? It was found he was later indicted in 2011, not for having an affair, which isn't illegal, but for the fact that he had actually misused public office, abused public office, I should say. Just from the Wikipedia article, following his 2008 campaign, Edwards was indicted by a federal grand jury on June 3rd, 2011, on 6 felony charges of violating multiple federal campaign contribution laws to cover up an extramarital affair, to which he eventually admitted. And it's particularly damaging because Edward's wife at that time, Elizabeth, was dying of cancer. So it made him, it cast Edwards in a pretty bad light. And he'd been quite a solid candidate up to that point, third after Obama and Clinton, Hillary Clinton. Um, in that case, it was probably valid that Edwards caught heat because he abused public office. I think the fact that he had an affair was bad enough, but I think it's the fact that he abuses public office by covering it up was the problem. So I'm not going to say that every single case doesn't warrant a story. Um, there's also the issue of hypocrisy. An example of this would be when Newt Gingrich was accused of having an affair at the height of the impeachment hearings into Bill Clinton, when, of course, the Republicans were pushing hard against Clinton for his extramarital issues, particularly with Monica Lewinsky. So then, for one of the chief architects of that to have an affair himself, um, says a lot about hypocrisy. I think if a politician is very much on family values and Christian values and all that sort of thing, and they preach about the strength of family and how people should stay together and they denounce adultery, and then they have an affair, it's found out that they have an affair, that's hypocritical, and there may be an issue in that because I think the public would almost tolerate a politician lying over a politician being hypocritical. But here's the thing. Now, in this film, it doesn't outright imply, and it's left vague enough whether or not Hart actually had sexual relations with this young woman. Nevertheless, the way he communicates with his wife, you get the impression, yeah, something happened. Um, I think Hart underestimated how much the media had changed at that time in the late 80s. But I think, as a general rule, if a politician has an affair, it's wrong insofar as it hurts their wife or their husband and their family. But I don't think there's a really credible argument to say it hurts the public. And when the press get obsessed by these things, I think it becomes problematic. Firstly, there's a paparazzi style doorstepping, which is implied in this film. I think it's something I've never had time for. When you get a mob of journalists crowding outside a politician's own home, sometimes at night time, it is accosment, and I don't think there's any justification for it, even if there has been an affair. I think the only occasion where that might be warranted is if you have someone who's maybe been found guilty of something and they're avoiding the press, but found guilty in a court of law, say a business person or a politician or a celebrity involved in corruption, and they have been proven without a doubt that they are guilty. But the way the press behave on speculation, I have a big problem with. Um, I mean, if you get a male politician who is seen with a woman who's not his wife, the tabloids immediately assume, okay, he's having an affair. Now, it may not be good PR, but she could be a friend, and it could just be a bad judgment call because it's bad optics. But are we now saying that male politicians cannot have female friends and they can't speak to them without other people around because they happen to be married? I think that's a really big problem. Um, I definitely think that in this sense, the media can go too far, where they start playing judge, jury, and executioner, and they would counter with this, but they're running for public office, therefore they should accept the public scrutiny. I would say, well, yes, on policies, but I do think there needs to be a degree of privacy even for public figures, because for one thing, their family don't choose to be public figures often. You know, their spouses and their children, their extended family. I remember a few years ago when Chuka Umunna dropped out of the Labour leadership race. That may be because he didn't have enough support, but he did cite that his he had a relative being facing a barrage of reporters on her front lawn, and this was some auntie or something, not a public figure at all. So when the press behave like that, I think it's pretty disgraceful. On the other hand, I do have some sympathy with journalists because I think if you're a politician, you do need to accept that there is going to be a level of scrutiny. And if you do reckless things, it's bad optics. So in the case of Gary Hart, he was seen with this young woman on a boat called Monkey Business. Bad optics. What is rather unfortunate, though, is where speculation leads to such a rush of judgment. And things have definitely changed. I mean, at least in America. I was going to say in Britain as well, but we had the Profumo affair back in 1963. That was a scandal. Maybe it's because we British were more prudish, but it brought down the Macmillan government ultimately. Although there was Cold War factors in that as well, it wasn't just about sex. Um, but if we look at the United States in the 60s, I mean, the Kennedy brothers were absolutely, players in that sense. It's well known. And I think the press well understood that, but they still laid off. Lyndon Johnson was said to be a womanizer as well. They laid off him. It's only really the 80s that this started changing. And I think there's a number of factors for that, but I don't think it's an entirely good thing. I think Gary Hart's right that there is a dynamic at play that is not a good one. Um, I mean, if a politician has an affair, it might mean that they're a bad husband, but does that mean that they're going to be a bad leader? King Henry VIII, and this is getting obviously well outside the realm of media, but King Henry VIII was a terrible husband. Terrible husband, there's no question about that. But he did modernize the English Navy. He did make England a major power in Europe. So that's just an example of leadership versus private personality. Um, so should we judge politicians by their private lives? I personally think press should back off a little bit, just a little bit. I think where there's serious ground of hypocrisy, that's a different matter. So, with the whole Dominic Cummings scandal, that wasn't a relationship issue, obviously, at least not nothing to do with romantic relations. But the issue with that, and that's where I was slightly more sympathetic to the press, was Cummings. It just came across as sheer hypocrisy when you had a major decision maker with huge influence on this government and in the Prime Minister's ear, who made decisions about lockdown that the rest of us had to abide by, essentially breaking those restrictions. I don't care what way it was glossed over, it was hypocritical. Um, and people got very biased on that along partisan lines. But what you had with that was both right and left attack Cummings. Um, I had some degree of sympathy in terms of the pressure he was under, in terms of the way, like I say, the vile doorstepping. I think that was unnecessary, and the journalists involved in that, weren't practicing social distancing themselves. It was ugly scenes, in my opinion. But for the Prime Minister's chief advisor, a man with widely thought to have immense power in this government, to travel hundreds of miles, breaking the government's own lockdown restrictions with the repeated mantra of stay at home. I do think that the press had a valid reason to scrutinise that and to put Cummings under pressure. Not in the way they did, not the doorstepping, but certainly with tough questions. And I think it says a lot that Johnson stood by him. I don't think that was loyalty of a friend. I think it's because Cummings has a lot of influence on the cabinet. But anyway, well, talking of Boris Johnson, we can look at the whole Carrie Symonds thing. In that case, there is some speculation that neighbours just had partisan grievances against Johnson. But, if you hear a man and a woman arguing, people might speculate something's going on and feel like being a good citizen by reporting it. Again, you had the press, going outside his door. They've been doing this for a long time. I personally would like to see an end to doorstepping, or at least it greatly minimised. I think I actually debated Nick Ferrari on this on LBC. I brought it up and I debated with Nick Ferrari about this very subject. He said that, I assume he'd been in leather at some point. Um, if he had to make the decision to send journalists to a business person or a politician's home because there was no other way to contact them, then he'd done it a few times. And I said, well, if politicians, business people refuse to make statements, let the public judge that. Just say they're not talking to us. But this thing that the press do of sort of acting like judge, jury, and executioner, I think doesn't make them look particularly good. And I told Ferrari that, in not those exact words, but he accepted it. He actually said, "Well, point taken." Anyway, let me know your thoughts. Should politicians' private lives be private, or is there a case for public interest? I don't agree with this idea that because someone is a public figure, then every single aspect of their life needs to be our public knowledge. I don't know. I don't want to know what Boris Johnson's doing in his bathroom. I don't want to know what Priti Patel does in her downtime, unless it's in an interview that she's, agreed with. I don't want to know what Dominic Raab or Keir Starmer um, get up to on their holidays, etc. Politicians are human beings, and they're under an immensely pressurizing job. And frankly, I think there's times the media need to back off just a little bit. Having an open and transparent media that can hold the powerful to account is very important for democracy, but the questions have to be important ones, and too much obsession with private lives, I think, puts people off. I don't think the public particularly like it. On the other hand, where there is a serious case of public integrity, i.e., misusing public funds, for example, to cover up an affair or lying to the public, I mean, I think in the case of the Lewinsky scandal, the damage wasn't that Bill Clinton had an affair, it's that he lied about it. So that gets into a question of integrity at high office. Let me know your thoughts.